Steffi, thank you. We all read a lot of books. David gave me a galley copy of the book, The Lucky Years, before Christmas. And I will say to you what I said to my wife last night. I said, honey, I've read this thing now more than once, and I don't think I've read a more important book that I can remember in the last 10 or 15 years. David is my doctor. And I think it's publicly worth telling you, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, PSA of 4.5. So message to guys here, don't get carried away by having a PSA of 4 or something your doctor says you're okay. You may not be. Good news, that was over 6 years ago. David is a scientist, an engineer, and a doctor. I'm going to tell you a story that I hope embarrasses him a little bit, but there's a famous guy in Silicon Valley, Sandy Robertson Coleman Stevens. There was almost no tech deal done from Intel and Apple right up until the end of the century that Robertson Coleman didn't play a major role in. They were the Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley of those days. I was at Sandy's 80th birthday a couple of years ago. Big deal. Everybody in Silicon Valley was there paying homage, and we're in our tuxedos, and I'm looking across the room, and the door opens, and David walks in. And I said to Sandy, that's David Agus. How do you know him? And he said, well, you remember in the 80s, I think it was, biotech was getting very big, and Paul Stevens and I didn't know anything about biotech. So we called up the presidents of the top 10 medical schools in America, and we said, who's your smartest student? And we went and spent a week or two and interviewed them all, and it was clear to us that the guy we wanted to hire was David, and he was our guru that helped us do that. And Paul, you're godfather to Paul's kids today. Last question. How many people in the audience have been touched directly, meaning your family, your wife, your mother, your father, by either cancer, heart, or diabetes? All right, then this book is for you. David, why did you write the book?
You know, I wrote the book because we are at it. You know, my mentor was Andy Grove, you know, the former CEO of Intel, and he had this term, and by the way, one of the greatest titles of any book ever, Only the Paranoid Survive, where he calls it inflection point, when the curve of progress versus time goes like this to this. Well, this is happening in our space now. Literally, there's a discovery every week happening. And so the book is to describe them and give people the hope and the optimism, but at the same time to push them to get ready and to change so that all of us can benefit from what's happening in the lucky years.
You made in the book, and I wrote them down, some what I call dramatic, at least for me, when I had to stop and then reread what you were saying, and then I read the whole thing to be sure I understood it. And the one that got me most, I'm an engineer, and so I'm data-driven. You said most medical studies are wrong.
If you look back historically at medical studies throughout the years, 90%, 90% of studies are incorrect or are proven wrong. And so the challenge is there's so much noise in our space. How do you focus and how do you pay attention? At the same time, there are studies from 50, 60, 70 years ago that were hidden jewels that all of a sudden now are popping up and literally being transforming what we're doing.
When we were together in October or November for my physical with you, you told me a story about one of the 50-year-old experiments that had, quote, been buried. I think that's a great place to start.
This is one of the coolest studies I've ever heard of. It was in the 1950s. This woman named Rhonda Ruth Lunsford published her only paper in Science, and she was actually kicked out. She took an old rat and a young rat, and she tied their skin together. And after about a day, their blood supplies joined, and then 3 or 4 weeks later, she looked. That old rat, the gray hairs turned brown, the heart was bigger, and there were more muscles. She claimed she reversed aging. Well, they called her Dracula and Frankenstein and pushed her out of science. Well, earlier last year, 3 separate labs, one at Harvard, one at Stanford and one at University of California, San Francisco, repeated Wanda's experiment, and it worked. And what they showed is that when you and I turn 25, our stem cells go to sleep. And there are proteins that can turn those stem cells back on. So you can envision in one day, not too far away, if you're elderly and you break your leg, we will give you a shot of these proteins to accelerate healing, because we've all seen how young kids heal. If you're older and there's neurocognitive decline, there's Alzheimer's, we'll give you a shot of these proteins so new neurons can form and get over the damage that these diseases cause. In my field, we're doing clinical trials now because cancer in kids is up to 90% curable. Once you turn 25, those same cancers are incurable. So if I could convince the body it's younger, maybe I can have an impact on cancer.
That brings me to the point. One of your recommendations was to save some of your blood every year.
Well,
what are you talking about, theoretically?
So not that kind of blood, but what we're talking about is that, the engineers call it delta. Change over time is probably one of the most informative things. You just said your PSA was for 4.5. Well, if it slowly rose to 4.5, from age 50 to 90, I wouldn't care. But if it go in 1 year from 2.5 to 4.5, I say, hey, I got to pay attention here because the delta, the slope changed.
Mine was 6 months, 4 to 4.5, and my then physician said.
Right, so there was a delta there. There was a slope. The problem is, most of the time, we don't have historical samples to go back on. So the notion that with this explosion in data, explosion in technology and things to look at, I want to go back and look at changes over time. The only way we can do that is if you store a sample every year. There's a new technology called proteomics, omics study of proteoprotein. So from a drop of blood, I can look at the conversation in the body. I can look at everything, all the communication molecules, and be able to look at them today. Well, it's a lot more informative to me if I could say, how did it change from a year ago, from 2 years ago, from 10 years ago?
We said cancer, we said heart, we said diabetes.
Yes.
You went through in your book.
I'm against them all, by the way, on the record.
You said they could be prevented.
Yes.
And you actually used the word prevented. Mm-hmm. Let's take them one at a time and go through it. Cancer.
So cancer, we've talked before on this stage about some of the simple ways to prevent cancer. And those are a baby aspirin a day reduces the death rate of cancer by 30%. Those are statins. Those drugs that lower cholesterol also block inflammation and have a profound effect both on preventing cancer and on making you live longer once you're diagnosed with cancer. Obviously, the stupid things like stop smoking, but one of the most simple ways is movement. Our bodies were designed to move. So your lymphatics that control your immune system have no muscle in their wall. So it's the rhythmic contraction of the muscles in your legs when you walk that actually make your body work. So just movement over time could be a staggering way to achieve reduction in cancer. And then there's the big part of which is diagnosing things early. Right? If you have a colonoscopy and we take out a polyp, you will not get colon cancer. If a child today gets an HPV vaccine, they will not get cervical cancer. So all of a sudden, we can start to knock off many of these cancers and dramatically reduce the incidence. Cancer still happens and will continue to happen, but you can dramatically lower the rate.
Diabetes.
Diabetes. Diabetes, adult onset diabetes, type 2 diabetes is what we call insulin resistance. So as we get older, our insulin goes up, and if it stays up, what happens is our body says, hey, I don't care about it anymore, and it doesn't respond. So, for example, people who graze, that is go out and eat whenever they're hungry, have a dramatically higher rate of diabetes than people who eat their meals at the same time every day. Something as simple as that will have an amazing effect, because if you graze, your insulin's always up, your body gets resistant to it. So meals the same time every day, nothing in between meals. Be lean body mass, try to sleep and eat the same time and exercise, and your rate of type 2 diabetes will plummet. The other thing with diabetes, this is the wildest study I've ever seen, is they took 20-year-olds and they gave them artificial sweeteners. So artificial sweeteners were the greatest food when they came out. They hit your sweet tooth, yet they weren't absorbed, so there were 0 calories. So they were perfect. But after 2 weeks on any of the artificial sweeteners available today, they all had markers of diabetes or prediabetes. They said, hey, that's interesting. And then they gave them antibiotics, followed by the artificial sweeteners, no diabetes. So what the artificial sweeteners do is they change the bacteria in our GI tract to push our system toward diabetes. You have tenfold more bacteria in you than human cells in you. Tenfold more bacterial DNA in Joe Schoendorf than human DNA. That's called the microbiome. So all of a sudden, we learn that these artificial sweeteners push our system to diabetes. Dramatic impact.
All right, so we've done diabetes, we've done cancer, heart.
So we all know about the aspirin and the statins, the Lipitor, the Cressors, and drugs. There are people who can't tolerate them or that the statins aren't good enough. And there was a new class of drug, FDA approved this year, both in the United States and in Europe. And what they are, the PCSK9 inhibitors. And it came from this study. You know, our field, historically, we throw out the outliers. Well, this was a case where they actually looked at the outliers. There was a family that had a total cholesterol in the 80s and 90s, remarkably low. And when they looked at them, they had no heart disease and very little cancer. And they looked and sequenced them, and they had a mutation in a gene called PCSK9, one of the cholesterol-carrying molecules. So several companies developed drugs that lower that molecule, and what do you know? Dramatic effect on heart disease. So all of a sudden, you know, we had statins that could delay things a decade or more. Now there's a new class of drug that adds time onto that. So certainly very informative. The other is obviously diet. Every diet that has been looked at, the winner by far is Mediterranean diet. So good fats, the olive oil, canola oil, the heart-healthy fish, grass-fed beef, fruits, vegetables. Eat your meals at the same time, Mediterranean diet, you're going to lower your rate.
I got to throw this one in. When David isn't being an oncologist and writing books, appearing on Charlie Rose at 4 o'clock in the morning, he's starting companies. You were talking about colonoscopies. One of your goals was to get rid of them. Tell us how you're doing that.
So I started a company, and again, you know, for the entrepreneurs out there, this changed my life, is that I was introduced to a guy named Danny Hillis. So Danny is an engineer, built the first supercomputer, discovered RAID storage. Thinking machines. So you put a remarkable engineer together with somebody who thinks about biology, and interesting things happen. And so we pushed on the technology of proteomics, and we developed a way from a drop of blood to look at who has a colonic polyp. So if you think about it, colonoscopy, it's a test that nobody likes, yet most people don't need it. If you had a colonoscopy and there was no polyp, you didn't need the test. So we developed a blood test for who has a polyp. So in the future, you will get this blood test first, and if you're positive, you'll go get it taken out, and if you don't, you'll wait another year or two.
How are you doing on it?
The test launched about 60 days ago or so, and it's doing very well. And, you know, I mean, certainly I wanted something that affects positively doctors, patients, and that the insurers aren't going to scream at, but actually like. And this is one that hits all three of them together.
All right, we've got a lot to move through. One of the other things that I think we worry about, I certainly do, is Alzheimer's and dementia. You wrote a very interesting chapter about how you might prevent that by the simple act of sleeping. Talk about that.
Well, you know, a lot of it comes from this area of big data now. So for the first time, we can start to query large data sets. Well, one of the biggest came here from Europe. And it was an amazing study, because what they did was they looked at airports, and they drew circles around airports. So the closer you were to an airport, the higher the rate of neurocognitive decline as you get older. What that implied is our brain needs quiet time to regenerate. And so many of us live in big cities. I have a 150-pound dog that snores, and I can't kick her out of the bedroom. So I have those orange foam earplugs I wear every night so my brain can get the quiet time it actually needs at night. You know, there are other aspects that can affect our sleep, and what we know is that if you don't get the requisite sleep, you're going to get a much quicker onset of that neurocognitive decline. So the screens, that little screen there, our iPhones, our TVs, they all have a blue light. And what that blue light does is it tells the brain, hey, this is the same wavelength as sunlight, and it's built into us. And we look at it and we say, hey, it's near daytime, and so even if you fall asleep, it's not deep enough. So you can get glasses that actually filter that out. There'll be the next iOS update for your iPhones will have a filter built in that takes out some of those filters that activate the brain. So I wear these little yellow glasses. They were made for gamers, right? Because gamers wanted to be able to sit in front of a computer for 12, 14 hours and play a game and not get tired. So they made these glasses that do it. So I need to watch TV before I go to bed. I like to catch up on the news and what's going on. I wear those glasses. I sleep better and I sleep deeper.
Moving right along, I wrote down loss of muscle means loss of life.
Yeah.
Stand up and live.
Yeah. You know, I mean, we mentioned earlier, our bodies were designed to move. And so if you exercise, just walk, for an hour extra a week, you're going to add a year and a half till the end of life. So just that, just moving. You know, the problem is, you look at the buildings today. All these buildings now are being designed to benefit the environment. They're LEED certified. Well, who's designing buildings that are health certified? The more important you are in a company, the closer your parking space is to your desk. The richer you are, the more bathrooms in your house, so you don't even have to walk room to room to go to the bathroom. We were designed to move. So redesigning our workplace, redesigning your life to encourage movement, and at the same time doing particularly strenuous exercise, your 20s, 30s, and 40s, you're banking up things that will last you into your 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So get up and move around. I love this saying to an audience that's sitting down now. But obviously, we were designed to move, and we have to do that. You know, I know it's not a positive thing to say here at a meeting of the tech world, but I'm not a believer in self-driving cars. I mean, I think that if you look through evolution over 1 million years, our brain evolved to be able to go for a hunt and find our way back to the village. That's who survived. So physical activity coupled with pattern recognition actually helps cognitive function. And so driving is good for us. There's an emotion to driving. We feel good doing it. So yeah, if you had too much to drink, if you're tired, you're stuck in traffic, the self-driving car is perfect. It's a great way for quality control. If you should have turned right and you're turning right too late, then maybe you're not paying attention and it should take over. But I think it's built in us. So get up, move, use your brain, do these things that we need.
This is one where I asked Steffi if I could have an hour because there's so much here. The following one is sort of my personal favorite.
Uh-oh.
It is better to be overweight and exercise than to be of normal weight and sedentary. Really?
Really. So if we look at the data, there's a clear association, right, with body mass index and heart disease, cancer, and, you know, croaking early. But when we start to look closer at the data, most of it is because being overweight is a surrogate for being sedentary. So movement over time is the key. And so, yeah, I'd rather you be lean body mass, and I'd rather, you know, you move both of them. But if I had to choose one, over and over, I would choose movement over any of them. So, you know, our devices today, whether it be your Apple Watch, your Fitbit, your Nike Fuel Band, are remarkable because it gives us a metric. We're metric driven. Isn't it amazing? Every hour, it taps you on the wrist, the watch, and says, hey, get up and move. You know, I was privileged to be involved in Steve Jobs' care. And Steve said, Agus, there are 2 reasons to go for a walk. Because every time we were together, we would go for a walk. The first, he says, is the health benefit. It goes, you clearly know about that. But he also said, if you're going to do a business negotiation with somebody, and you go for a walk, and you know where you're going to turn left or right, and they don't, it gives you a slight advantage in the business negotiations. So Steve thought on both angles of these things.
I think it's public knowledge that David was Steve's doctor starting at the 2nd year of Steve's illness. And we'll talk later about what it might have meant had they got going a year earlier. On the normal exercise, overweight, you had a declarative and measurable sentence in the book where you said a brisk 20-minute daily walk reduces the risk of premature death by 30%.
It's pretty amazing.
How'd you get that?
It's not me, it's the data. Again, these are big data studies looking at. You know, there's a wild guy who created 2 companies in his lifetime. He created Atari and he created Chuck E. Cheese, a guy named Nolan Bushnell. This is the guy who had 2 Steves working for him, but when they said, I want to put the screen and the computer together in one, he pushed them out and they went to form a company called Apple. But he did a study where he took kids, and if they exercised for 20 minutes, they retain up to 19% more in their brains for 5 hours. And yet we put all the exercise at the end of the school instead of the beginning of schools. We need to figure out a way to kick all of our butts and get us moving.
Probably for me, the most depressing point in the whole book was, and I sent it to Steffi, and I said, Steffi, give me 5 more minutes, and I'll tell you why the probability of you outliving Paul is medically probable. Why do women live longer than men?
Why do women live longer than men? You know, the answer to that I'm going to give you a little bit differently. Elephants are 40 times bigger than you or I, yet they don't get cancer. And it's an amazing finding. The reason is, evolutionarily, they have to live long, right? Elephants give birth in their 60s. Elephant male, even when he's 70, which is the year they die, 70 to 80, they guard the herd until the day they die. So evolutionarily, they were necessary. Through evolution, once we hit around 30, we're no longer necessary. We use housing, we eat food, and we don't give anything back. Women were a little bit different. Women have obviously the maternal function taking care, but through evolution, we needed them a little bit longer than we needed the male. You know, those teenagers, they took over all the hunting and the gathering for the 30, 40-year-old men, so they were not necessary. The women still took care of, you know, children and grandchildren, so they evolutionarily were selected longer. And it probably has to do with their estrogen. It's a protective effect on the heart, et cetera. They get the same diseases we do, but it's delayed by about a decade. But we can learn a lot from that elephant. It turns out you and I have one copy of a gene called P53 that corrects DNA damage. Elephants, we just learned, have 20 copies of that same gene. So they figured out a way not to get cancer so they can live until their 60s and 70s and still be reproductively functional and having a role for the community. An amazing study by looking at the outliers.
All right, so now for a final one, and this is what I have vowed to do when I'm going to Davos tomorrow with David, and then when I get home Monday. You talked about what to do and how to start to take advantage of what's in the book, and you said spend 2 weeks and do what?
Well, I want you to do a 2-week challenge and kind of get to know yourself. You know, the first one we talk about, again, it's this cool big data study. If you sit on the floor like this, and if you can get up with one hand or no hands, you're in the top 25% of musculoskeletal strength. And according to this big data, you'll actually live longer. So it really is get to know yourself. And it gives a list of things I want you to look at over 2 weeks. So you start to focus on what you need to pay attention to, what you need to discuss with your physician. And a key, this 2-week challenge is key. Going back to Hippocrates' time, knowing yourself was key in medicine and health. No technology will replace looking at yourself and listening and knowing.
Our time has just run out. David, thank you for writing The Lucky Years.
Thank you all.
Do the 2 weeks.